Ziggurat 2 has changed a lot since I first looked at it back when it actually entered Early Access, and one of the things I wanted to do with the Hitchhiker's Guide to Early Access series was eventually take a look at the games again once they have either built up a very large number of updates or have actually come out of Early Access entirely, something I need to be doing a lot more of. So I wanted to take a look again at Ziggurat 2 now that it's been released, and it's been added to so much that it's over twice the game it was when I first looked at it, and some of its mechanics have even been pretty much entirely overhauled. So it seems like a really good time to actually take a look at it again. So first of all, what is Ziggurat 2? Well, it is the sequel to the original Ziggurat, obviously, and that game was actually kind of an interesting beast because it was one of the first attempts at a first-person roguelite. This is back when games like The Binding of Isaac were still sort of the king of that genre as it was still forming, and the term roguelite was sort of a brand new thing. And first-person games in general are pretty hard to make on an indie budget, something I've mentioned before, so it was really impressive and pretty ambitious, even for the fact that the game was quite small, to actually make a first-person version of this genre. But it actually ended up really, really good. It was, like I said, a fairly small game, but it did what it did very well, and in my opinion, it actually stayed as the best example of a first-person roguelite for quite some time, probably, honestly, until this game came out. We had a few other examples, games like Immortal Redneck, for example, but they just didn't quite capture the spark that Ziggurat did, and I think part of that was the feedback of combat and the way that the weapons feel, which is a very important and very difficult to nail down thing in a first-person game. It's often where a lot of the expense of these games comes from, is the animation quality and the sound quality of all your first-person animations to make your weapons feel satisfying. But Ziggurat 2 has actually taken a lot of lessons from both the first Ziggurat and the gap in time of other games that have tried this in between, and it has created something that has really matured into quite a really good game. Now, since this genre has been around for a little while now, we've had time for people to come up with complaints, the things that they dislike about it the most, the kind of more common things that tend to happen with these games that some people really don't like. And that's actually a really positive thing for a game, especially in early access, that is developing after all of this knowledge is now available to try and solve it themselves. And I feel that Ziggurat 2 actually does two really big things to help two of the biggest complaints of this genre. One of the big complaints is that the starting weapon that you get is always very weak. It is just sort of anemic feeling, and that is a very common complaint of pretty much all roguelites, that you start with a sort of infinite ammo weapon that is very basic and not all that fun to use. And Ziggurat 2 does two things to avoid this. One, it actually gives you a ammo-using weapon right off the bat, so you actually start with two weapons. You don't just start with your infinite ammo weapon, so you don't necessarily have to use it if you don't want to. But secondly, it makes the infinite ammo ones actually fun to use, which is important. They don't feel weak and annoying to just plink away slowly at enemies. They actually have a fair amount of impact to them, and although they are wands, all the weapons in this game are magic, not guns necessarily, although some of the alchemy weapons are guns. So the feedback is going to be a little bit different from like a traditional shooter. The weapons still do actually feel quite good to use, and I think that actually goes a long way to addressing those complaints of starting with a very weak feeling weapon when even the basic ones of the game are actually still pretty fun. And one of the other most common complaints that you'll hear is that sense of very slow progression, where the game only actually has one dungeon, and you start at the same floor every time and you work your way through it. And in traditional roguelite style, you're meant to make it farther and farther each time until you eventually find a way to beat it. Games like Isaac and Gungeon, for instance, do this. They have one main dungeon with some optional branches or other ways to diversify it a bit, but it's still one major dungeon that you're actually going through, and that means you're going to start roughly on the same floor every time. And although some of us actually enjoy this, it is still one of the most common complaints of this whole roguelite thing, that this feeling of starting on the same floor of the same dungeon every time gets old after a while, and repeating the same thing over and over can actually be kind of annoying. Ziggurat 2 changes this up by making it to where you actually go through a series of mini dungeons instead of one large dungeon that you're meant to progress through slowly, farther and farther each time. Instead, you're actually meant to complete each dungeon in one run. Completing the dungeon in one run is not a traditional roguelite thing. You're not supposed to beat it your very first time through, but in Ziggurat 2 you actually are. You are expected to be able to beat each dungeon in one go because they're each their own self-contained little mini-adventures. And I think that does a lot to address the problem of repeating the same floors over and over when each dungeon is its own self-contained sort of mini-adventure, and there are a lot of other ways to diversify them and make them different, and you don't necessarily feel like you're constantly starting on the same floor over and over again. Instead, you'll be selecting from a series of different mini-dungeons that are available each time you go to the main world map, and each one will have a different length as well as a different threat level that tells you roughly how many floors it is and roughly how threatening the enemies within it are. And as you complete dungeons, you'll eventually find the sort of main dungeon of that part of the story. Each of these actually has a bit of a story element to it, and will also unlock a new character when you beat it, but it does tend to be the hardest dungeon of that particular set that's available, and also usually the longest as well. And every time you beat one of these main story dungeons, you will unlock a new tier of mini dungeons that are available. Each will be longer and more difficult than before, so as you go through the game, you still get a sense of progression, a sense that you're actually accomplishing something, and it will unlock more and more variety in more and more difficult mini dungeons to actually access. One of the things that's been completely changed up from the early access version is the progression method of your items and characters. Originally, the way that it worked is you earned gold in run, and you could spend this gold in run shops, as is traditional with the genre, but you could also save it, and when you actually completed a dungeon, you took this gold back home to you, and it was available at the sort of hub area, and when you took items and characters into a dungeon with you, they would slowly level up. Once their experience bars reached full, you could spend some of this gold that you had in order to level them up and make them slightly more powerful, and sometimes unlock some passives for them at certain levels. This has been totally changed into how that it works, and I think the new version is a lot better in terms of giving you a better sense of the fact that you're getting stronger over time, and it's not tied to gold anymore. Now, gold is simply something that you'll use in-game to buy from shops and to re-roll results of shop inventories and level ups and stuff like that. It is not something that you take with you back home, which I actually like a lot more because it incentivizes you to actually use the gold on in-game items and stuff instead of saving it till the end and not actually using any of it, making the shops a lot more important and a lot more useful and stuff in general now because you're actually willing to use the gold on them. Now, instead, you earn mastery, which is a sort of experience for everything that you bring with you. Your character, as well as all of the items, amulets, weapons, and everything that you bring, all have mastery levels, and as they level up, you will get these mastery points that you can actually use to spend on in-game skill trees. There's actually a selection of 4 relatively good-sized skill trees, each devoted to different things, from like elemental damages to overall character development and all sorts of things like that, and these skill trees, as is traditional, will unlock more and more stuff in them as you put more points into each of them, so they're relatively good sized and they have a nice variety of different things for you to buy. This means that you feel like you're getting stronger after each run a lot more than you did before, because leveling up your gear does make it a bit stronger, but it also gives you these points to spend on the skill trees at the same time, so it actually incentivizes you to level up more stuff, whereas before, oftentimes you would only want to bring the highest level stuff you had with you because it was the most powerful, and now, since you actually earn these passive points by leveling up more gear, it's actually a good idea to spread those levels out on as much gear as possible so that you can earn as many points as possible and expand your skill trees a lot more this way, so it's actually a good idea to use new gear now and constantly switch up what you're actually bringing with you on missions. Other things they've added include some very welcome changes like drastically improving the enemy variety and the boss variety. There are way more bosses now. A lot of them are actually pretty unique and have some almost like raid boss inspired seeming mechanics that make them pretty fun to fight, and the overall enemy variety is drastically increased from the early access version as well. Now there are tons of different enemies to face, which is always necessary in a first-person game like this. You know, the more enemies you're fighting, the more variety in gameplay there is, so having a lot of different enemies to face is a good idea. Also, there are a lot more weapons and amulets and items and stuff to use now, as well as every character, by the way there are more characters too, every character having their own unique level up perks available, so not only does every character and weapon have passive improvements to themselves that they'll get after they reach certain levels, but certain characters also have certain passives that are exclusive to them that you can get from leveling up in run that generally improve things like their active abilities, so that makes each character more individual feeling to play. They've really gone out of their way to drastically increase the weapon variety and make sure that there are tons of different damage types across every different weapon slot. From your basic wands to alchemy weapons, staves, and spells, there are now a lot of different things to find and unlock, of course, as well. And they've done a really good job to make sure that the weapons are very fun to use, very satisfying, have a good amount of feedback, and all work quite differently. You know, you can choose 10 different staves or 10 different alchemy weapons or whatever, and you'll find that pretty much all of them feel different. Even ones that do the same damage type often have various different gimmicks that make them unique to each other, so the overall variety in weaponry feels really, really good, and that was actually one of my favorite aspects of some old school magic themed shooters like Hexen and Heretic and stuff like that, was that in terms of magic weapons, there's generally a lot more possible variety than in something like guns, because guns will inevitably mostly shoot bullets in some way, so there's only only so much variety you can make in those without going like full-on realism. If you're going for more of a fantasy setting and you can use magical weapons, there's a lot of crazy stuff you can do with these weapons to make them feel unique, and I feel like they've really taken that and ran with it in Ziggurat 2, making a large variety of weapons feel really interesting because they're all so different, from crazy poison flamethrower things to big staves that shoot huge volleys of big pinning ice shots to basically railguns. There's pretty much any sort of fantasy weapon you can think of in this game now, and it really helps having such huge enemy and weapon variety to make the overall gameplay loop feel a lot more satisfying and a lot more varied. They've also noticeably increased the variety in different tile sets that you can come across, which makes the levels feel more varied, and they've also added a lot of extra modifiers and other level types that you can find. For instance, there are now gauntlet levels, which are like multiple wave enemy defense sort of levels that act as sort of large survival dungeons instead of like a long multi-floor dungeon, and there are also a lot more different room types that you can find, and other modifiers and extra just special things that can happen in the rooms that give you more varied objectives than simply to kill all the enemies. There can be all sorts of other objectives and other modifiers that are thrown in there to make the dungeons feel a little bit more varied as well. So they've definitely taken the whole variety aspect of the game and cranked it up a lot since the early access version. Really, I'm just pleased in general to see the state of Ziggurat 2 upon its release, and a bit afterwards now. It has really developed into a fantastic first-person roguelite. It is, in my opinion, the best example of a first-person version of the genre that's actually available on the market right now. I think it does everything that it needs to do to be a super satisfying and highly varied and interesting game, and it makes all of the right decisions in terms of solving certain problems that people have with the genre, as well as having its own identity. I think Ziggurat 2 is an absolutely fantastic example of a first-person roguelite, and if you're at all a fan of games like this, then you definitely owe it to yourself to check it out. The link will be in the description below this video if you want to go to the Steam page and actually take a look at it yourself. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.